Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow here at the Institute and director of the Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. And we are honored to have with us today Representative Tony Gonzales from Texas, 23rd District, who is now in your second term in Congress.
Goes fast.
That's right. Well, so Congressman Gonzales is a representative, obviously, but more importantly, he's a retired Navy Master Chief cryptologist, which is very relevant to our conversation today, which is going to focus on how do we secure cyberspace and how do we make it so that our software and our hardware delivery pipelines for the United States remain secure and assured in the face of foreign and domestic threats. So thank you very much for being here.
No, I'm excited. I represent 823 miles of the southern border. So oftentimes the discussion is on a physical barrier and security. It's always good to talk about the virtual space.
Right. Well,
there are no boundaries.
Exactly. Well, in a lot of ways, it's a much more challenging space to secure.
Absolutely.
The border is obviously very difficult.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
Cyberspace, you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't hear it, but you got to be able to protect it.
That's right.
So how do you think we're doing as a country in terms of defending our critical infrastructure, our military systems, kind of those most important elements of cyberspace? And then how does that compare with maybe how we're doing in the commercial, consumer space?
Yeah, to me, there's no doubt that the United States is the gold standard for cybersecurity, and there isn't a close second. Yeah. And you can see, just look to real world scenarios like the Ukraine-Russia war, where here we thought, Russia was this big 800-pound gorilla that was in the cyberspace that was going to do X, Y, or Z. And it turns out they're terrible, not only at cyberspace, but actual wars in itself. So I think that's a start. I mean, the United States is by far ahead of everyone else, but we can never rest on our laurels. And part of it is how do we bring our allies, natural allies, alongside us to make sure they're also up to speed. The way I look at it, it's not only your traditional Five Eyes, your traditional kind of partners that have been with you for decades. It's also creating other partners that may not traditionally be aligned, but once again, in cyberspace where there are no boundaries, you may have common interests.
And that's a great point, because I think a lot of times we get focused on the Five Eyes and these closest intelligence sharing allies, because we're thinking of everything in terms of the secure military information system, the intelligence gathering systems. But there's a lot of other parts of cyberspace.
Yes.
And we need to think about cooperation outside of those. So countries like Japan, Korea, Israel all offer a lot of skill in that area. Do you see opportunities for us to work more closely with their government services, or is it maybe the commercial sphere where we can maybe get a lot more of that cooperation going?
I think all of the above. You bring up a good point. This was a space that was predominantly in the defense and national security realm, and now it's in everything that we do. Yeah. I often say each company is an IT company first, and then they do other stuff. Then they sell widgets, or they transfer oil or gas, or they teach education, or healthcare, you name it. So it's muddied. I mean, it's in everything. And when I think of partners, I don't just think of the more traditional partners, but I think of Taiwan. I think of India. I think of these they may not have access to our most sensitive things, but maybe they don't need that.
Right.
And to the point of industry is so critical to it all. I go back to my time in the Navy. Oftentimes, and I'm dating myself a little bit, we'd go, all right, we need this piece of equipment to do this job. And we didn't have it. And it would take us X amount of time to get it. So we just go to Radio Shack and build out our own kind of piece of equipment. And that's what industry does, is they can fill a need real time, not go through the defense procurement process, and then wait 6 years to get something that's already obsolete. Right. And in technology, I think that's what you got to do. You got it real time, real world scenarios.
Right, and we're starting to see that when you look at how microelectronics has evolved, right? Yes. Because it used to be that you pretty much had to build it all yourself in the military because you needed custom chips, you needed things with certain characteristics, and now you're finding that we can go buy a lot of this on the open market and then use software to be able to take a high-end chip and use it for something like a radar, or a radio system. So with that, as we evolve the military microelectronics ecosystem to be more commercially derived, what kind of cybersecurity challenges does that present? I mean, do we have to think about things like zero trust, and how do we do that?
No, it's a good point. And kind of back to the United States being the gold standard, the issue is you have to get it right every single time. When you play defense, you have to get it right every single time. And you're just not going to do it, especially when it's no longer your traditional actors that are attacking you. It's everybody who can afford an off-the-shelf system now, right? It's not just good guys and bad guys lining against each other. It's all this gray area. So my approach has always been, if you're playing defense, you're losing. To me, the best defense is a strong offense. And this is what I'd like to see the U.S. government really work with industry, work with academia, and find ways where we can use our offensive capability in a manner that is a deterrent. Is to go, hey, look, you can hack us all day long. We're not gonna get you every time. But if you do, here's the hammer that's going to come knock you over the head.
So that's a good point. Cybercom adopted, I guess maybe 5 years ago, this new approach of forward defense. We're going to operate inside of opposing networks. We're going to let them know sometimes that we are there to kind of put them on notice, and we're going to engage. Or we're not going to let provocations pass without some kind of response. But I've heard that that maybe isn't working consistently. I think there's also a problem with maybe commercial networks being brought into that. Do we need to think of expanding that model beyond just, I guess, the military systems where we probably have used it most frequently?
Yeah, no, I think so. And it's really working through the bureaucracy in it all. I mean, do you want it to be, do you want the decision making to be at General Nakasoni's level? Or do you want it to be at the tactical level where there's a Air Force captain kind of making a decision? I'm not talking about shutting down a nuclear program or or some of these kind of very overt cyber tools. But I'm talking about some of these other things. Preventing a big part of it. The space is misinformation and disinformation. I mean, this is an area that bad actors live in, and they kind of take a truth and they spin it and they turn it into a half truth, and then ultimately it's a lie at the end. This is where the battle is being fought oftentimes.
And so we need to think about that. A good point about it's not just about responding to a computer hack or an attempted computer hack. It's also, how do I respond to misinformation that is going on my networks that's just as damaging as the hack. So do we need to think about maybe empowering industry, commercial, because a lot of these networks are not owned by the government.
That's right.
There are things that are being operated by commercial providers. Do we need to deputize them essentially
to start
doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think of misinformation, you think of elections. How do we secure our elections? How do we prevent external actors from influencing not only the United States, but let's say allies, or let's say jump balls. Let's say countries in Central and South America that you're seeing kind of change direction. I think that's important. But now let's add industry to it. Well, what happens when an actor comes and attacks your corporation and says, your cars fall apart after X amount of time, or your product causes cancer. I mean, this is the world that we're living in now, and to me, there's nothing more valuable than trust, right? When a company's trust in their product or in their service is their staple, and if you undermine that trust, all of a sudden, maybe I want Coke instead of Pepsi. So it just, I mean, the world is changing. And it's no longer, in the defense space.
Right, and it can be sometimes a lot more damaging to a national economy than the Coke Pepsi discussion, right? So if you're looking at, if you're TSMC, for example, you are the national champion industry of Taiwan. And if TSMC suffers, Taiwan suffers.
And the world.
Right, and the world suffers. So securing both their networks and securing their reputation as a in terms of information, those are both things that the U.S. should be interested in. That's assume, but we're obviously held back because they're not part of our the club of the Five Eyes or our intelligence sharing.
I visited Taiwan about a little over a year ago, and I'll visit again here in a couple weeks. And this is where I think it's important that the United States is the leader of the free world, and it's important that we go out there and build these relationships. We don't respond to something that already happens. We try to get ahead of the problem as much as possible. And to your point, when we've seen it when the semiconductor industry gets strangled, everyone pays for it, from the chips in your cars to your phones to everything, really.
Right,
So
right.
this is an area where it's absolutely in our best U.S. national interests to protect some of these industries, and it goes well beyond national defense.
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting conundrum, right? So we're trying to make the supply chains more resilient and expand production to the United States through the CHIPS and Science Act. But also we don't want Taiwan to feel like we're trying to decouple ourselves from Taiwan. So how do we balance that? How do we make Taiwan feel like we're still behind them while at the same time expanding the supply chain to new places that maybe are going to be more resilient over the long term?
I mean, a lot of it is about collaboration, is having the discussion early and often, and not being afraid of these are my friends, and walking through this to go, we're not trying to create winners and losers, we're trying to create winners and winners, where it's good for everyone. And I also say it's not just the White House's responsibility. In Congress, the easiest thing to do is to punt to the executive branch and then blame them for everything that's wrong. And be like, oh, see, they can't get anything done. Members of Congress very seldom want to point the finger at themselves and go, wait a second here, we're an equal branch of government. We have a role to play. Part of what I've tried to do, especially in this political environment, is find ways where we can come together and go, wait a second, we can have difference of opinions, we can have different philosophies, but we should all be rooting for America to continue to be the beacon of hope and the leader of the free world.
Right. And so to that end, as we look to try to secure cyberspace, we need to be securing cyberspace not just when it comes to the United States. Then we need to, the attack surface is such that if you attack Taiwan, if you attack Japan, if you attack Korea, you attack Europe, you're going to impact the United States. So I assume it seems like what you're saying is it's in our own best interest to help these other countries and companies improve their ability to protect their cyber exposure.
Absolutely. It's all fun and games till all of a sudden I can't get, a vehicle because there's no chips. And you're seeing the world is very interconnected now. There is no longer this, what happens over there doesn't impact us. And there can be Europe or Asia or the Middle East or South America. The world is so interconnected. I think it's important that America be on the forefront of it and build these partnerships. It's the reason why I do so much foreign travel and try to build these relationships out and get ahead of some of these problems. And once again, how do you put the bad actors on their heels to go, wait a second, and we're not just playing defense here. We're not just going to let you hack us or our allies and get away with it. There's got to be some repercussions. Right,
and which I'm glad you brought that up because this is an area we've been looking at Hudson. Is how do you put bad actors on notice that you're going to try to deter them because otherwise they could be encouraged, right? So China has done a lot of gray zone activities over the last decade or so where they've harassed their neighbors, they cut off sea lines of communication, they build islands and they put weapons on them in the South China Sea. So they're kind of pushing the envelope in terms of forcing their opponents to relinquish sovereignty or to give in to Chinese demands when it comes to the ability to control various places in cyberspace, in the waters or on the air. The most recent being the balloon that recently floated over the United States. Gate. Another example of China pressing the envelope when it comes to sovereignty. So how do we need to think about, as a government, better securing cyberspace because there are so many, parts of it that are not under the U.S. government's control. So very little of it is actually under the U.S. government's control. And Cybercom can only do so much to defend it, even with their kind of persistent engagement strategy. I mean, how do we get the commercial actors in here to be able to better defend themselves and be part of a unified effort to shut down efforts to hold at risk cyber targets?
I think one is you have to understand that the actors have changed. A lot of the actors have remained the same, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Some of these actors have remained the same. But now everyone is in this space. And what I mean by everyone, once again, going back to the border, I represent 42% of the border. Well, cartels have gotten extremely rich off of what has happened the last several years. So their businesses, their corporations, they're going, hey, how do we diversify our portfolio here? And maybe we don't just do fentanyl, maybe we do fentanyl, human smuggling, and now maybe we do ransomware. Maybe we do some of this. And so I'm seeing more and more of that, of these actors that normally weren't in the space building out these teams, and everyone has a farm that they're kind of creating and going from there. That's one, is the actors have changed. And I think that, once again, going back to every company is an IT company first, we have the expertise. We, the United States, has the expertise within our industries. Right. I look at it, and I introduced this bill last year, and I introduced it again this year. It's the Digital Core Act, and essentially what it does is, in case of emergency, and go back to in Texas about a year and a half ago, there was this huge winter storm that wiped everything out. You were without power. In some cases, you were without water for a week. Didn't matter your big city, small town. Didn't matter how much money you had in your wallet. Didn't matter the color of your skin. Everybody was without power. And so I envision that the next storm will be a cyber storm. And when that happens, who helps turn on the power? You mentioned it earlier. Yes, we've got Cybercom, and yes, we've got some of these traditional infrastructure, but now are you responsible to turn on little old Uvalde? Right. You know, who's going to go? Yeah, Uvalde needs to go first. Everyone's going to have a pecking order on what gets turned on first. I think part of what we need to do is we need to deputize, if you will, the industries and allow them to serve in a federal capacity for a limited time. You know, I'm not trying to kind of create a new system here, but just go, hey, in case of emergency, break glass, we have the expertise, and they will help turn on, return on the infrastructure.
Right. So, to broaden that discussion, to talk a little bit about industry, I wanted to bring in some additional panelists here. So I want to turn to Cliff Bean from Peraton, and also our own Jason Weiss from Conquest Cyber. So we're going to have them come on up now. We're going to have a discussion talking more broadly about the role of commercial technology in cybersecurity. Jason Weiss, here from the Hudson Institute, as well as from Conquest Cyber. Jason was previously the Chief Software Officer for the DoD, the first one, as it turns out, and is also a former Navy cryptologist. And to complete the trio of cryptologists, Cliff Bean is here from Peraton, where he heads their Navy business, but Cliff is also a career cyber officer in the U.S. Navy. And served in many capacities focused on strategy and guiding the development of our cyber capabilities. So working at the highest levels there. So thank you very much, Jason and Cliff, for being here. So we were just talking about how we need to think about deputizing or bringing commercial industry into the fold when it comes to cybersecurity. I assume though that it's not just in terms of response. How do we do this in the day-to-day when it's not necessarily a crisis? How should we be thinking about bringing more of the commercial expertise into the government's, in a lot of cases, relatively outdated IT capability?
Yeah, first I'd say it's great to be surrounded by so many cryptologists. And when I was in the Navy, I would always joke, everyone knows CTs run the Navy, cryptologists run the Navy, and now it's apparent that cryptologists are everywhere, even outside of the Navy. So it's great to be around that. I mean, to your point on the day-to-day, and this is really how you get ahead of a problem, there has to be more collaboration with government, industry, and academia. I think that in itself, that is a recipe for success. And when you have more of that, all of a sudden you're getting ahead of the ideas instead of responding to it. As a member of Congress, I'm leaning towards people in these spaces to give me advice and craft through it. Because when you mention cyber, everybody wants a cyber bill. Oh yeah, put it together, a cyber bill. And their knowledge of it may be 1 inch deep. And my knowledge may be a little deeper, but the longer I'm retired, the more I become a dinosaur, and it doesn't take long before all of a sudden, the techniques that you were going off of have changed. You're seeing that space immediately change. So it's how do you work with industry and academia to craft legislation that ultimately improves the problem, doesn't create more problems. You see it all the time on the Hill. You have these bills that have great names, great intentions, and in reality, they have second and third order effects that are only going to cause more problem. I'll give you an example. As you kind of create these CIOs within these corporations, that's great, right? You have this leadership in there. But if I'm a mom and pop shop where I'm already the accountant, I'm the janitor, and now all of a sudden I got to be, the networks analyst that handles it. It's a lot of different hats to hold. It's one thing to encourage that and create more. It's another thing to go mandate. You will do this, or you won't have access to these grants or these other things. So I think that's where, to me, as a member of Congress, I look for collaboration. I think we need more of that ahead of it.
That's a good point. CMMC has been a particular area that people have complained about quite a bit. But so Jason, you've written on this on the use of commercial software expertise recently. So how should the government tap into that?
So building on what the congressman said, I think if you look at the models that exist out there, we often think about force multipliers, right? And a common way to achieve that is through this train the trainer model. And when you look at secure software development, right, where do our cyber problems come from? They come from software. If we think about securing the software development, if we were to employ and maybe pivot something like a train the trainer model, where you went out there and you looked at these institutions and these organizations, academia, and said, hey, you've got a really secure software development ecosystem. Let's make that more accessible to other folks. What we see often as the problem is that small business is almost disincentivized from contributing and helping with government because they see regulation, they see paperwork, they see terminology like siege rules, and they go, what is that? I'm out. You see problems with the seed capital rounds. The venture capitalists will look at that funding model and go, the time and investment to do something with the government versus just focusing on the private sector, let's go private. If we were to look at how we can accredit the secure software development enclaves, the software factories as they're called, and actually allow these startups to have the ability to build secure from the start, we overcome part of that chicken and egg problem with doing business with the government. The government wants you to be secure and accredited before you can ever get on their network, but to be secure and accredited, you have to have a government sponsor. Well, how do I get the government sponsor if I'm not built secure? And so there are a lot of organizations that have started talking about why doesn't the government open up and say, hey, look, we're going to show you how you can engage in secure software development on one of these certified ecosystems that's run and operated by industry, academia. And now we've overcome that problem. You don't have to have that government sponsor first. And that's a really simple, low-hanging way to approach the cyber problem is start with shifting that security left, allowing these small businesses to build secure from day one.
So Cliff, jumping off of what Jason was just talking about, Peraton does a lot of software development for the government. And I know you're trying to bring commercial models of software development and software pipelines into that process for the government. How has that gone in terms of the challenge of trying to work within a government acquisition framework, but use commercial SecDevOps type models?
Yeah, so we're doing that in many contracts. Some for the Navy, there's a demand from the customer to transition to more regularly updated code and updates, to the capability. I think the challenge, if I could frame it a couple ways, if you listen to the flag and general officers about things like, JADC2 or Project Overmatch or whatnot, they've got the vision. They're saying the right things. The problem is when you get down to the RFP, the actual request for proposal, it's a cut and paste from 5 years ago and probably cut and paste from 5 years ago, right? And so I read RFPs and they're not modern, right? They're not leveraging what could be. So first of all, I think there's part of the government that should modernize what we're asking the contractors to provide, because it is ours to provide what they ask for, right? The other thing is, we do not build the resiliency into the tech that is sold. So, you go buy computers, first thing you got to do is make it government compliant, right? And we do that all the time. And so I think if you listen to some of the leaders in government right now talking about, cyber resiliency, baking it in instead of, modifying it after or going and patching. I think that is absolutely that. And companies like ours would then have less lift to make it government compliant because it started that way, right? And lastly, I would say we're missing out on some real innovative tech in startups and in the, what we call going from the garage to government, right? Because one, they do not have the money nor the desire to do business with the government because it's just too hard. And so they're looking for folks like us to make their stuff government compliant. I think that's a model that we could leverage to get some of that cool stuff out of young people's minds and into the hands of warfighters that would be far faster than the current acquisition process, right? But if we started with better code, if we started with more secure software development capability, this becomes a lesser lift. So I think that answers.
So Congressman, to get at that, I think one thing that jumps out is we need the expertise in the government to be able to ask for the right things from industry. Because you can say, I think we often say, let's turn this project over to a commercial provider because they can provide the up-to-date, latest technology. Right. They know what they're doing. But then you got to craft a RFP and a contract in a way that actually lets them do that. And we just lack that expertise in the government. How do we bring more of that kind of cutting edge, expertise in this area that's very dynamic into the government, which is sort of built around the idea of stability and people join the government and be there for 30 years?
I think a large part of it is less of direct transfer and more of an ecosystem. If you build an ecosystem that encourages government, academia, and industry to collaborate together on a daily basis, right? In San Antonio, I'm lucky to be in San Antonio, where we have NSA Texas. We've got UTSA, one of the leading institutions on cyber, various different forms, and then we've got access to large corporations as well. And so when you have these ecosystems that create this environment, you break down some of the barriers and you have more direct collaboration. And so if I'm a customer, let's say I'm the government looking for an RFP to be delivered, and I'm going, I could go this route, or I have the answer right here from this startup that would otherwise never have access to me or any of these other things. I think that's a big part of it, is these ecosystems.
And I guess you could do what Cliff is talking about too, where you can pair up a more experienced government provider to work with a startup to help them make their pipeline compliant with government requirements.
That's right.
So can Congress try to create more of those sort of, I would say nodes of, where you can have this kind of ecosystem develop? I mean, it sort of naturally happens in places where you've got NSA sites, but is there more that the government can do to facilitate that?
I think so, and there's an economic piece to this, where if you build these nodes or these centers, and all of a sudden you can thrive. So I think there's an opportunity through that lens, through an economic lens, to help craft that. And once again, I think a big part of it is getting lawmakers out of the mindset of, I am going to dictate to you what you need to do, right? And oh, by the way, that's going to take years to get over the finish line. So when it is law, it's already obsolete. And kind of give you more, instead of creating more restrictions, creating essentially less restrictions and allowing you to operate in a manner that is useful. And you can tie some measurements to going, hey, if you don't do this, you're not going to get this, and encourage it to kind of to work. And it's not just a blanketed, we threw money at it and mission accomplished. You can go, we threw money at it, and if you want more money, show us
some progress.
Yes, exactly. Some return on investment. But I think more of that, and this is where, once again, lawmakers all want to have a cyber bill that goes, I have solved the cyber problem. And you go, okay, well, first off, what is cyber? You got to drill down. It's not just this one term that, check in the box. I think that's a big part of it, is just helping create these ecosystems that thrive.
Right. And I think that brings up a good point about this idea that this ecosystem gives you the ability to bake security in from the start, as opposed to this being a firewall we're going to build after the fact. We're kind of closing the barn door after the horses are already out. So Jason, you've written a lot about this idea of changes to how we do software acquisition, or leveraging the authorities that exist more effectively. Because as the congressman's saying, you can create these ecosystems, and we've created the software acquisition pipeline, or pathway rather, software appropriations. We've got consortia that can do OTAs. Is that working, or are those the tools that we need to use to create the kind of security bake-in approach you talked about?
Yeah, Brian, I think we have a lot of tools in the toolbox, but right now they're not fully being exploited to their full advantage. So if you think about the software acquisition pathway, can anybody, to the congressman's point earlier, name an industry or a product or a technology that in some way, shape, or form isn't touched by IT? Right? Even the cereal that you buy off the shelf in the grocery store, there's all of the IT behind the marketing, the packaging, the actual running of the factory, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to get into this mindset that everything is touched. And so when you start looking at things like the software acquisition pathway, that can be applied to virtually every single procurement across the Department of Defense. And those concepts can be applied across the totality of government. So in the case of the pathway, it actually has a user agreement. And that user agreement says, hey, look, you have to have total access to somebody who can speak and make decisions, act as a decision authority on behalf of the user population that this software is intended to serve. And that's very powerful because when we think about cyber and we think about software development and the speed, that ramp to rate, how quickly can we put out a patch in the event of a 0 day? Having that ability to get that decision right here, right now, hey, is this going to work? As opposed to, I've got a meeting next Tuesday from 1 to 3 and we'll discuss it, right? It's those types of pivots that we need to make. We've got some tools, but we're not fully maximizing them. We're not leveraging them and embracing them, in my opinion, at the level that we should across the government.
Right. Which gets to this idea of, how does the government tap into the expertise, right? Because we may never be able to get inside government the level of expertise you need to be able to make all those decisions independently. So you need to work with industry and with the academic community more effectively. So Cliff, you guys have experienced the transition to these new tools for software acquisition. Have they been paying off, or are they still being used very sparingly? I don't have a good sense of how effective.
No, I think so. In all situations, going to a DevSecOps approach is faster, better. The challenge I think we see is not in writing the code and modifying the code to deliver the features that are being asked for and desired. It's then getting it approved. Okay. Yeah. So I modify it significantly, and now I got to go through some ATO process or something that is not modified. So on the government plug-in to that, often we're still doing waterfall approach to approving the development with a DevSecOps approach to developing. So we can write code really quick and have it tested, validated, and be confident in it. It's often that delay, and we're working with our customers long-standing. We have a contract with NavAir that is in my portfolio, and we work with the government partners to say, we could go faster, but we need you to integrate your team into ours in order to do that, right? So, but I think as well to the workforce piece, I would just add that, often the barrier to get into government is pretty steep, and I think the younger generations, will have more jobs by the age of 35 than I only had 2 jobs, right? So how do we make it easier to jump in and jump out, right? And so especially the NSA, if I think, we had young sailors, soldiers, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen that would have loved to have stayed in Hawaii, and they had the certs, they had the clearance, but it takes forever to flip their badge, and they can't afford to sit there forever. How do we make it easier for folks to be a part of an ecosystem, go work with industry, learn a lot, make a little money, come back to a Govy job?
That's right.
I think we need to look at ways like that. The reserve issue also, some of the folks doing this work in cyber they wouldn't fit well into one of the service reserves.
That's right.
But if we had a reserve where you maybe didn't have to have a haircut, that I think has got some merit to it of getting the civilian, allowing them to serve, right?
I want to add on that. Speaking to the choir, I want to add on that. That was a big part of the Digital Reserve Corps, is not to create another element, is just to tap into a pool of folks to go that are very patriotic, that love this country, want to help turn the lights back on, but maybe they don't want to be a Marine and do 100 push-ups, or maybe they don't want to stop smoking marijuana or whatever it is, right? And I don't need you to, right? All I need you to do is grab your keyboard and help turn the lights back on. I want to also mention one thing is, why is this important to the everyday person, right? And oftentimes we get in these routes and they go, well, that's fine, that sounds great, but that's not going to impact me. So I visit this this facility that manufactures adult beverages, right? So there's liquor as far as the eye can see, right? We're there and they're showing me all their automated systems and they're just so proud of how efficient they're being and this, that, and I go, what if I told you if I was a state-sponsored actor, that I wouldn't shut down the oil pipelines, or I wouldn't shut down the banking institutes or the healthcare. What if I thought, hey, I'm going to use my expertise, my influence to shut down the alcohol in which a country consumes. And all of a sudden, that's what I wanted to do. And I go, how would that impact everyday life if all of a sudden you can get your booze because somebody hacked your system? And you could see the glaze over their eyes to go, holy smokes. And I go, this is why cybersecurity is important to you and to me. So it's those kind of those everyday things.
Well, and that's a good point about the digital core, is that those companies aren't going to have the expertise to necessarily protect their systems like they should. So those SCADA attacks, that's probably a really soft target, I assume, for somebody to go after. But if you had a core, a reserve core of people that could go out, and part of what they do is survey these companies and help kind of bring the better practices to them, it seems like that'd be a really beneficial dimension of it. Jason, I wanted to follow up on something that Cliff had brought up about ATOs, a continuous authority to operate, which is something you've talked about. Is that something we can afford a commercial, or let's say an industry provider to do today for software, where they can just kind of keep pressing as they develop new capabilities and work those into the pipeline and
yes, one of the confusing aspects of CATO is there are many across government that think that that's actually a reduction in cybersecurity, and that nothing could be further from the truth. What we're saying is, instead of a paper checklist every 3 years that says you're compliant, we want continuous evaluation of the way that software is built, designed, delivered into a production ecosystem. And that CATO consists of a couple of key ingredients. The first is the idea of the secure software development factory that we already talked about. The second is this idea that you have to have continuous monitoring. And to me, continuous monitoring isn't, hey, I'm going to show up to a meeting once a month and look at some PowerPoint slides. That's not continuous monitoring by any stretch of the imagination, right? Getting people used to this idea of real-time dashboards, actually looking at the vulnerability, the risk, the exposure, what the impact is of these new designs that are being pushed out in this release this week. We can do these things. We have the aptitude to do these things. We just have to understand that we have to pivot from the idea of a monthly PowerPoint to, I'm going to look at a live and living dashboard, look at my risks, look at what my exposure could be, what the mitigations are, and go, yes, let's go ahead and ship that code.
And so I assume that's how like a pure commercial play company would do it, right? This is not
correct.
This is sort of unique.
Correct. We see that all the time, even in my current position. I have dashboards that give me deep insight into what the CVEs are, whether they're applicable or not, what the mitigations are, the ability to understand the totality of the microservices that are actually powering our system. It's all in a live and living color dashboard right there for me to make educated and informed decisions without waiting for a PowerPoint at the end of the month.
So Congressman, that makes me wonder, the companies like the beverage company,
Sure.
that seems like it's going to be beyond their ability to handle. So when you talk to companies like in your district about this idea of being an IT company first and then everything else second, how are they? What do they think? What do they say? Hey, I need the government to help me do this, or what? If you want me to do something different, you need to support me in doing so.
Depends on the size of the company. I mean, the larger the company, that's already baked in. They have some expertise on it. And no one will tell you we're doing a terrible job.
Right.
Everyone is like, no. Those problems are out there. Inside here, we're doing an amazing job. And you know what? It's not in their best interest to say that, right? I mean, that's going back to the trust factor. If you do have an intrusion, who's going, hey, they got me. How do we prevent them from getting my neighbor? Everyone is keeping quiet. So there's all these individual silos that have to be broken down as well. I know we discussed a bunch of different items, and all that's great. I think the mindset and some of these things, but I look at it as, okay, what can you do today, right? How do you impact things today? Sitting on the appropriations committee to me is extremely powerful, where you can find these accounts that are doing good work, and you protect them and you grow them. And there's no doubt in the 118th Congress there's going to be cuts, and you got to be able to go. You can't do universal cuts and expect good things to happen. At the same time, the spending can't continue to rise the way it is. There's this balance. Part of it is members have to understand what they're cutting and what they're protecting, because you can break things. And so one of the things that our office has done is, hey, how do we understand these accounts line by line that are doing good work? And I think that's one area where industry can help and to go, wait a second, this is something that works. We need more of this, or this is something. I'll tell you, no one has ever come to my office and said, "Hey, Tony, can you give us less money?" Right? It's always, we're the best, we're doing more money. But the more lawmakers can understand that, I think from an appropriation standpoint, you can protect the things that are working instead of taking a step backwards.
Well, so Cliff, from the perspective of an industry provider, what do you think are some things that the government has started with regard to software delivery and cybersecurity that are working, and that should be protected as we think about what to do in the next Congress or this current Congress?
Yeah, so I just had the privilege of hearing Chris Inglis speak about what he's been doing, and I'm more optimistic about the view looking forward. The analogy that he gave that I thought was powerful was, if you think about being in a car in the 1960s compared to today from a safety perspective, it's night and day, right? I mean, we didn't even know where the seatbelts were when I was a kid, right? They were tucked behind the seat. But what happened? Government didn't legislate it all, right? It was some legislation, it was some regulation. But it also was the manufacturers got behind it, and they decided it was important to them. So a few things, that are different, right? We have a shoulder strap that we didn't have when I was a kid. That was industry innovating to make it safer. Airbags, industry innovating to make it safer. Volvo commercials when I was a kid running a car into the wall. It was kind of like getting awareness that we can make the vehicle safe. And so they transferred all the risk from the end user. Not all of the risk, most of the risk from the end user to when you go buy a car, it's got safety features, including anti-lock brakes and all of that, right? And you don't then take it to an aftermarket to make it safe. It's built in. And I think that approach in this to how do we make the average American safe on the internet, which we're all now connected for everything we do, but it's not necessarily a safe environment, right? And so I think that line of thinking creates less expensive than us saying we're going to pour a whole bunch of money into this. It creates market forces that have an effect. So build the resiliency in and be less responsive because you were better, you had more resiliency to start with. And my last point on that is the user still has to put the seatbelt on, although that annoying buzzer keeps me from doing that. But you could have a Ferrari, if you decide to drive that off-road, well, that's on you, man. It's not what the manufacturer intended for. So I think it's a good model. Also, semis, right? It takes more licensing to drive a semi than it does to drive another vehicle. So I think it's a good way of looking at the space going forward.
So, Congressman, what are some ways that the government can incentivize companies to start to differentiate themselves based on what they have in terms of cybersecurity? I mean, Apple has obviously made that part of their privacy as part of their marketing effort. But is there something that the government could do to try to make market forces start, forcing people to bake security in when they build software?
Yeah, two things come to mind. One is training and access to training. I think that's one big area that the government can do is encourage industry to get involved, and whether that's by providing clearances or access to very specialized training. I think that is key to it. I think that gives an incentive. Why am I going to let my best, if I'm a corporation, why am I going to let my best people go off and do something else? No, I'm trapping them in the basement, shackling them to the desk. They got work to do.
Exactly.
But wait a second, if I can grow them and not pay for it, maybe I let a few of them out of the basement and go do something else. I think that's a big part of it. And then the other is just is once again creating these environments that allow for it. And these environments aren't where we think they were. I mean, we think they rely on national security space, and they're in everything. And we got to view the world through that lens. And it's not just the United States; it's in every country. And so we got to be able to go. Yes, it's important that U.S. companies are taken care of, but how do we partner with these other countries that create these relationships and strengthen their networks as well.
Right, and so you try to make it so that these partnerships, these ecosystems, part of the price of entry, if you will, is having the correct processes. Is that what we're Jason, we're getting at is the idea that you need to have. It's not that you have to be certified at a certain level, but you've got to have the right processes in place to be able to participate.
I think it crosses all three of the components of innovation, right? People, process, and technology all play an important role there. Before the event, Cliff and I were talking, and we were looking at the role of certifications. Right. And not everything requires a 4-year degree. I was talking to some folks in my professional network, and they worked at a major college institution, well-known brand name, and they were indicating that they had this aspiration to bring cyber into more of the engineering disciplines, the structural, mechanical, chemistry, all of that has to think about the role of cyber. And there was a little bit of support so long as it didn't require more classes, that it would extend the degree time, and it didn't take away anything from the existing curriculum because of the various engineering accreditation that's required. So with that 13, 14 minutes that's left over, put all the cyber you want in there. And I think that really epitomizes where the 4-year institutions may not be the best source for some of our cyber needs. We may not need a 4-year degree. And I think the government in particular, as Cliff had shared with me beforehand, has an opportunity when we look at some of these job postings, when we look at what the government actually needs to execute on a contract. We may not need somebody that has a PhD behind their name to actually bring real value to the table and help strengthen our cyber resiliency.
I want to add something briefly is oftentimes I would be the only Hispanic or minority in the room when we're talking about cryptology. And I think there's also an opportunity to go to untapped parts of our country and then you like, look, I don't need you to be a PhD in this. If I can get you up to speed in a very short period of time, you all of a sudden are making a livable wage, and that economically rises. I represent a district that's 70% Hispanic. And I go, we need to be going to some of these schools earlier. The earlier we start going to some of these schools, plant these seeds, whether it's in cyber or whether it's in space or some of these leading technologies, and then sell these trades or these certifications. And all of a sudden, from a workforce standpoint, it seems like everyone's fighting for the same. You're going to be an engineer, you're going to be a doctor. We're fighting for that same
kids.
The same STEM kids. How do you go to an untapped market and all of a sudden offer? And we're not talking.
And if we look at the data, the BLS data said that in January we had 5.7 million unemployed Americans.
Yes.
At the end of December, BLS also reported there were 11 million job openings. Think about that, right? We take everybody that's unemployed, put them in a job, and we're still looking at roughly 4.3 million, 5.3 million that need jobs, or that need to be filled. Got tongue-tied there, right? But when you start looking at those reports and you look at that data, there's a lot of underreporting of people that are interested in jobs that aren't showing up in that data that may excel in these areas and have the aptitude to do these jobs. And if we can figure out creative ways to partner, public-private partnership to engage at that level, it could be a game changer.
We haven't even talked about immigration yet. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities to be able to, if you think a different way and you build it out a certain way, I think there's a lot of opportunities for us because the world is competing for this talent. It's not just us. We all need it. How do we win that battle?
That's what's so attractive about your ecosystem model is that you can have people come in through the educational system and they can they see opportunities for jobs because in that ecosystem there's going to be a bunch of employers. Or if you're coming in as an immigrant and you got an H-1B visa and you're worried about, well, what if I lose my job or is my visa going to go away and now I'm stuck? But there's other employers that are also in that ecosystem that might be able to give you an employment, and to keep your visa going. So it creates a lot of stability that I think would be attractive to people to enter it from the workforce perspective. I want to open it up to questions from the audience, if there's any questions from the audience before we wrap up here. But one thing I wanted to ask about is the role of hardware. We talk a lot about with chips and hardware and how important is hardware to cybersecurity. Jason, I mean, as you've looked at this, how critical is hardware and the role of like zero trust as we think about using commercial electronics in a lot more national security applications, not just the military.
It's definitely a consideration that can't be minimized. If you think about the underlying execution set in a CPU, for example, you're going to make certain assumptions when you're writing software that true is true and 2 plus 2 is 4, and that chip isn't going to fraudulently underrepresent or overrepresent something. Unfortunately, software developers with things like precision and rounding errors and floating point, there's enough places we can make mistakes on our own. But if we can't trust the underlying infrastructure that's powering our systems, there's a fundamental problem there. And that's going to take a lot of understanding about the supply chain.
Right, right. It is, Cliff, when you've, in the work that you guys have done at Peraton, how much do you have to, think about the underlying, because you're using a combination of like military custom built electronics and commercial electronics, I assume, in a lot of the systems that you guys write software for. Yeah,
I think, so most of the foundational gear is stuff from Microsoft or, Amazon or what have you, right? We do develop some things from scratch, especially our labs, Peraton Labs, does a lot of leading edge stuff, mostly classified for government, right? But we're not fabbing our own chips, right? So, and very few places in America are. So you have to trust that it's going to do what you say it's going to do. When I was a young ensign, NSA made their own chips up at Fort Meade. We had bunny suits and we made chips. But it got to be too expensive because the miniaturization of, twice as much processing power every year, we got out of that business. And then we let a contract to have a trusted foundry build our chips for national security communications. And so we paid a U.S. company to do that with all U.S. people. I don't know where we are today with that, but, we did offshore it all, or most of it. And we do need to bring it back. We've got to be able to trust, especially with the demonstrated intentions of other nations to do bad things. We can't rely on them for our chips. In the metals too, right? Don't forget that you can't make chips without the metals, right?
That's right. Right, and Congress has been taking a lot of action on that. I mean, this is an area where there's been a lot of focus, both in the Chips and Science Act, which is also looking at materials. So,
but believe it or not, people will lie to you. If you go, hey, are you reshoring and nearshoring everything? Yes, of course we are, and they are at this percentage. Because they'd love to do it otherwise, but they can't. Right? You can't just all of a sudden turn something off and turn it back on in a different place as much as you want to. I'll give you an example. I visited Monterrey, Mexico, a few months ago. And Monterrey is this huge city, larger than Los Angeles, a couple hours from San Antonio. And they're like, hey, look, we're the perfect environment to nearshore all these things from Asia. But we don't have any water, right? We don't have any infrastructure. And then we don't have any people to run this deal.
Yeah.
And so when you kind of think from a government standpoint, from a Congress standpoint, you can't just go, mission accomplished, we passed this CHIPS bill, all of a sudden we won the war in nearshoring and reshoring. You got to be able to go, okay, what is actually happening and how do you, make it to a substantial point, not just, a line that people lead with. And in reality, the bulk of everything still remains in Asia.
Right. Well, and I get to your idea of, you need more collaboration, both from the national, but then that state and local governments are also a big player when it comes to affording the kind of infrastructure you need for a factory or a fabrication plant to be viable.
That's right.
So it seems like, having those systems set up is maybe a more important, that should be a focus of of legislation, is to let's set up the system so we can have this collaboration.
And then let everyone take hold from there. If you build it, they will come.
Exactly. Well, I think that's a great point to stop on. So, I'm sorry. Well, so if you have a question, please do.
Question, probably for Jason or Cliff, but...
Here's a microphone.
Oh, yeah. They want you to
I'm Scott Cooper. I'm a retired Marine, and I worked with Cliff at Peraton. Last week at a session at the German Marshall Fund, Nate Fick, the ambassador for cybersecurity, mentioned that a lot of the Russian cyber attacks against Ukraine have been ineffective because they've been able to push fixes to many of these vulnerabilities quickly, and that's one of the reasons they've not been effective. I thought, to a conversation Cliff and I had, he was on the George Herbert Walker Bush just a few years ago before he retired, the most advanced and newest aircraft carrier, and they were running Windows XP that came out in 2001. I did not work on a Commodore 64 in the Marine Corps, but I worked on some very, very old computers. That is one of the challenges I think that we face, is making sure that we have software and hardware that is up to date. How do we plan for that? And how do we ensure, especially also knowing that my personal computer was always newer and more up to date than what I was given by the government?
Right. Yeah. So is that an area where, the Congress is, obviously when you're on the Appropriations Committee, you're looking at, well, where's the money going? You can spend a lot of money on IT and not necessarily get something for it. So is the DoD in particular, are they doing a good job at being able to apportion those IT resources in ways that allow you to keep the operational systems as up to date as possible? And should we be better, aligning ourselves with industry to take advantage of what industry can provide?
Yeah, look, it's a difficult problem set. DoD in particular is a large organization, right. A lot of computers to cover, a lot of systems to cover. But of course, they'll tell you they're doing a great job, right? Those are all problems that everyone else has, but we're good. Everyone will always say the same thing. Yeah. So I think as Congress needs to be that balance, that check and balance, that goes, look, I'm happy to provide the resources to do that. Just show me the American public's return on investment, and also push the envelope. Like, maybe we don't have to do things the way we've always done things, especially when it comes to the information space. Yeah. We need it today. We're going back to that real world environment, and it's no longer just our most sensitive computers. It's everything that we operate in. So, and it's no longer against the traditional actors. It's all these actors that are going, yeah, I may not be able to hack in the SCIF, but I can sure hack, something else, on the surface of the ship.
Targets.
Some of the softest targets in it. So I think that's the role Congress should play, is not take away the money. Not like you're not going to get any money. You're like, look, you're going to get the resources you need to do the job. All I want to know is make sure those resources are not just going to archaic systems that are 6 years behind. I need some cutting edge stuff. Different way of doing it.
And Ukraine's done that in the breach, right? So they've been forced.
They've been forced to.
Right. So they've been forced to take advantage of commercial technology.
Taiwan's another one. I mean, Israel's another one. I mean, these countries that are, whether they want to or not, they are at the front lines of it. From a United States point, how can we learn from that? How can we go, okay, what are some of the things that work, that don't work, and how can we incorporate them into our larger systems?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Congressman Tony Gonzales, for being here today.
Thank you.
Jason Weiss from Hudson and from Conquest Cyber, and also Cliff Bean from Peraton. Thank you all for being here today. We appreciate your time and the great discussion. And from the Hudson Institute, thank you for being here. Have a great day.